Lease options, what are they? How do they work? Are they even legal? How do you find them and how do you make money from them? I want to answer all these questions and more for you in this video. If you're watching my videos for the first time, my name is Hussain, and on this channel I have 3 videos a week to help you get further faster in your property investing journey. Let's get straight into what is a lease option first of all. So a lease option is made of 2 components, a lease and an option contract. Sometimes they're called purchase lease options, and essentially the lease is like a contract where you have no different from, say, leasing a car, leasing a house, any other type of premises. It's a lease where you're paying a certain amount, usually on a monthly basis, to have access to a particular asset, in this case a property. And the option is the right to buy, which allows you to purchase that said asset or property at some point in the future. So essentially when you combine the two, you are leasing a property for a period of time with a right to be able to purchase it at some point in the future. Let's talk about why you would want to use lease options as a strategy. Well, ultimately it's about controlling the asset, generally for a long term, so that you can add some value either to the property or you can benefit from the uplifting value over time on that particular asset. So there's some great reasons why you might want to do this, and the type of person that you're looking to speak to get this type of deal from is generally somebody that will already be motivated, keen to sell, or sometimes known as motivated sellers. Not desperate sellers, because you don't want to be working with somebody that's a desperate seller. Often they're not thinking logically. You're working with somebody that's motivated, that's keen to sell, and trying to offer them a solution. So why is it that they would want to do this particular strategy for you? We talk about the benefits for you. You're controlling the asset, you're paying very little up front. Sometimes people talk about buying a house for £1, you're only putting £1 down. Well, generally people refer to the pound because something has to be put down to make it contractually legal. Minimum tends to be £1. In fact, you can actually do it with a peppercorn, but I don't know many solicitors still accepting peppercorns. So £1 generally is the minimum amount you put down. It doesn't mean the only way to do this means you have to put £1 down. It sometimes could be significantly more depending on what the deal is, but generally a minimum of £1. And then you're paying a certain amount each month, and that amount that you're paying may be the equivalent to what the mortgage payment is, or what the market rent is, or whatever you negotiate. So why is it that somebody's going to give you this property in this way to allow you to benefit? What's in it for them? Generally speaking, it's about them getting away from the property and getting away from the debt, as opposed to getting some immediate financial gain in their pocket. Often it's a case that they want to get away from the property or the debt rather than getting some cash in from the sale. This is why it works for them, and it will work for you as well. An example of why somebody might want to do a transaction in this way is if they need to get away from the debt and don't need the money immediately, is for instance if they're in negative equity. So what that means is that they owe more money in terms of debt on the property than the property is worth. For instance, if it's worth £100,000 and they owe £105,000 on their mortgage, they are £5,000 in negative equity. So if they were to sell that property, it ultimately means they've got to stick their hand in their pocket or into their savings account to bring that £5,000 into the transaction in order just to be able to get away from that particular property. And for many people that really doesn't work. And I did a video on a case study very recently. We'll link it down in the description below. Make sure you watch it at the end of this video, where I talk about an example where a couple were divorcing. They needed to get away from each other. They wanted to get away from the house as well because of bad memories and experiences they had at that particular house. And it worked really well for me to be able to structure it in a lease option. And I think it was about £70,000 we made from that property over the time that we had it, from the rental profit and also from the profit at the end. So make sure you watch that video. Another example where I find this strategy works particularly well is with tired landlords. So they may have 1, 2 or several properties, and they really had those properties for a number of years, and now the market's changed, circumstances have changed, they're getting a little bit older, regulation is getting more and more depth into the layers and layers being added on every year, and they've just had enough and they want to get out, but it may not be selling the property right now isn't necessarily what they want to do. So being able to structure a deal in this particular way might mean you take all the headache away from them in terms of they don't have to deal with tenants anymore because you're now leasing the property, but you've also agreed to purchase it at some time in the future. So what that could mean is they might be able to get a better price because you'll agree a figure at some point in the future that you're going to pay them. So that means higher than what it might be today. So it works for them. and it works for you because you're going to be able to maybe add some value to the property, improve the quality, also be able to provide better quality accommodation, charge a higher rent, make a profit on that as well as being able to get some uplifting value. But remember, it's really important when we talk about solving people's problems and working with motivated sellers that you don't transfer their problems to your problems. So what we don't want to do is inherit problems, we want to resolve problems. So what do I mean by that? Let's say, for example, a landlord has a property that's a buy-to-let, they have it tenanted, and they have an electricity pylon at the end of the garden, as some properties do in this country. Now, not everybody necessarily wants to live under electricity pylon, but health issues and various things as well. So how can you resolve that problem if you were to purchase that property? Well, the answer is you can't. So you can't physically move the house anywhere else, you can't move the electricity pylon. So in that case, you'd be inheriting a problem. This is what I mean about resolving problems and finding solutions as opposed to inheriting them. Another example of how a lease option can work really well when working with a portfolio landlord is if they've got a number of properties they want to sell. Let's say they had 3 properties and they want to sell them, and the profit that they make from them, they're going to be paying considerable tax, I expect, on those, especially if it's quite a profit that they've made and they've had the property for a number of years. Now, they will have some capital gains allowance each year, and what that means is that they can offset a certain amount of profit that they make, usually about £11,500, about thereabouts, or if it's a couple, double that. However, if you as a purchase lease option decide that you want to buy those properties, might be you purchase one right now and you have a lease option over the other 2, and you stage those purchases, so one could be next year and the third one could be the year after that. So what that would mean to the seller is that you're able to stage those particular purchases, and the reason it will work for them is because they can utilize their capital gains allowance each year, and so be able to reduce the amount of tax they're paying by selling the properties to you in this particular way. Let's now jump into how you would structure these deals. The really great news is when you come to structure these type of deals, they can be very flexible in terms of how you put them together. For example, when you're doing a purchase lease option, you've got to work out how much is you going to pay the seller up front, how much is it you're going to pay each month as the lease, and how much is it you're going to pay at the end when you purchase the property. So there's 3 different amounts, but these amounts can vary depending on how the deal is structured. So for instance, you could be paying £1 at the beginning to be able to make that contract legal, so very little for the seller up front. Then you could be paying, for instance, a very low rent each month that might just be servicing the mortgage on the property, but you could be paying a very high figure at the end. Or it may be that you're paying a higher rent in the middle, but you get a very low purchase price at the end. Of course, these things depend on your deal. They're very flexible in terms of how you put them together. And that's the powerful thing about doing deals in this particular way. Also, when you're doing deals like this, what you're doing is you have a right to buy, so you're not obligated to complete on that particular transaction. Now, of course, you've got to think about what you're committing to, what you're saying to the seller. So if you're saying to the seller, hey, look, I'm going to purchase this property in the future, then you've got to think about the ethics and the morals to ensure that you do complete on that transaction. But legally, you are not obligated to. Now, in some circumstances, the seller is going to want that commitment that you are going to purchase a property and you're not going to walk away. So there you could structure the contract slightly differently, and you can set it up as an exchange with a delayed completion, or sometimes called long stops, instead of a lease option. Now, the difference between the two is that you are legally committed and obligated to complete on the transaction when you use an EDC or exchange with delayed completion, whereas a lease option, you're not obligated. If you'd like to learn more about exchange and delayed completions, make sure you pop a comment into the comment section below and we'll organise more content for you. And if you're enjoying this video, make sure you hit that like button and ensure you subscribe to the channel. Enable that notification bell so YouTube notify you when these videos are released. And of course, if you find this content useful, share it with a friend. Let them know that so they can learn from these videos too. Another thing to be mindful of when it comes to lease option and exchange and delayed completions is stamp duty and when stamp duty is payable. Unfortunately, I see many trainers teaching lease options and teaching them badly, and the reason they get a bad reputation is because I think it's some of the trainers are inexperienced. They're teaching theory as opposed to practical knowledge of how to do these transactions. So sometimes you might hear that you have to pay stamp duty when you exchange, but not stamp duty when you are acquiring on a lease option. And this is not true, because stamp duty is a very complex area of tax and it's important to get the right advice. There are certain circumstances where you have to pay stamp duty at the point where you take on a property on a lease option, and not just when you exchange contracts. How else can these type of deals be structured? There are in fact many ways they can be set up. Let's talk about a few more examples. For instance, what you could do is do what's called an assisted sale, which is where you're working with the seller of a property, and rather than you taking it on for any long period of time, what you're doing is taking control of the property, adding some value and selling it on. So for example, it might be you agree an option agreement, let's say £100,000, you spend £10,000 renovating that property, let's say it's worth £150,000 now, so you control that contract and you control the property, sell it for £150,000 and pay the seller what you've agreed. And this way the seller maybe get more than what they were trying to get at the moment in the marketplace, and you're not having to go through the purchase costs and all the stamp duty being paid twice, i.e. once by you and then another time by the buyer that purchases it from you. Another example of these type of contracts could be you have an option where you then take the property straight to auction. So you could agree to purchase a property via an option agreement where you've got control, and then you take that contract effectively to the auction and you sell that property in the auction. Now, if it doesn't sell in the auction, or you don't quite achieve the price you want, you still have control of that property depending on what sort of time frame you've set it up for. The option agreement can be used on its own as well, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a lease option with the two contracts combined. So with the option agreement, for instance, you might be looking at, say, a piece of land where you might want to get planning permission, say build a couple of houses on there. So you agree an option where you agree to purchase the property for a certain price at a time in the future. But in the meantime, although you don't own the land, you don't control the land in the sense that you're not leasing it, you're not using it, but you have enough control over it to be able to go and get planning permission on it, get the uplifting value, and then decide to either purchase it yourself or offload it to somebody else. And on that point, it's really important that your contracts are assignable. And what that means is when you have a contract, if you choose, you can assign that right to somebody else, so somebody else can benefit from that contract. So rather than you purchasing the property, which is exercising your option, where you purchase the property and your right to buy, and then you sell it to somebody else, you can essentially just move the whole contract to somebody else and pay a fee. They'll pay you a fee for that. And this is often how land deals are done as well. The flexibility of doing contracts in this way means there's so many ways that you can benefit, and also you can get the seller to benefit as well. So for instance, if you're looking at commercial property, you may have heard of capital allowances, where you're allowed to claim these allowances back to offset against your tax that you might pay in the future, or against your profits to reduce your tax bill. What you could do is help structure a deal in this particular way, where the seller is able to claim these back because you're managing the process for them and helping them benefit financially that way as well. And also this being a benefit to the seller is another reason why they might want to work with you. Now, when doing these type of deals, the really important part is you're using solicitors that understand these type of transactions. Unfortunately, there's very few solicitors that actually are familiar with these types of deals, and I've probably worked with about 7 or 8 in England that are familiar with these contracts. And at that note, it's important to mention that this strategy doesn't work in Scotland because the property rules are different. This works specifically in England. So there's about 7 or 8 solicitors that I've worked with, and I've done these type of deals. On finding a competent solicitor that understands these type of transactions, don't scrimp on the fees and pay them whatever their fees, because there's a lot of work that they need to do to make sure that this contract is solid. In terms of how much you will pay, probably about £1,000 upward, maybe £1,000 to £2,000 at the top end in terms of doing these deals. Now, when you're dealing with a seller, depending on the seller's circumstances, because sometimes they might be financially strapped, which is why they're trying to get out the deal, you might be paying the seller's fees as well. So you might have those fees to consider as well in the transaction. So be mindful of the overall fees. What are the risks then when doing these type of deals? It sounds like they're amazing, they're absolutely the best things to slice bread. Why aren't we all just doing lease options and forget everything else when it comes to property? Well, I think it's like a toolkit. It's having a tool that's going to serve that particular job that you're trying to do at that time. So lease options don't work in every single scenario. It's about if that scenario fits, then you can set it up in this type of way. But when doing these deals, there are some risks attached to it. So I've done probably more than 30 of these over the years, and I've had probably 2, I think if I can remember, maybe 3 that failed, that fell flat on their face, and I lost money on those. So yes, they absolutely can go wrong, and there are some risks. So let's talk about what some of those risks are. So when doing these strategies, it's remember you shouldn't be counting your chickens before the eggs hatch. What that means is the contracts are going to run for a number of years. Sometimes things can go wrong. So for instance, what if the seller changes their mind? Well, contractually, you could take them to court, you could pursue them, and you could enforce that sale and make it happen. And I know friends that have done that, particularly in London when prices have gone up quite a bit. Say for example, let's say you've agreed to buy a house for £100,000. Right now the house is worth that, they just want to get away from it, and you've say got a 10-year agreement. In 10 years time, or within 10 years when you come to exercise your right and purchase that property, let's say it's worth £200,000. Now some sellers might start getting a little disgruntled and thinking they're giving away £100,000. The reality is you resolve their problem, they got rid of that property as it were, and it's not really theirs, just like if you had sold the house. But in paper, it's still their property, so legally they're still the owner, you have a right on that property. So you can have a seller that throws a spanner in the works. Now personally, what I would do, I would just let that property go as opposed to trying to enforce it through courts, because you could spend tens of thousands of pounds, and the only winners in that situation is not going to be the seller and it's not going to be you, the buyer, it's going to be the solicitors in terms of the fees that they will earn trying to pursue this for you. There are some people that question whether lease options are even legal. I would say they absolutely are, but unfortunately too many people don't do them correctly and effectively set up illegal arrangements or contracts that are not enforceable, and this is why lease options get such a bad rap. But those that understand the details of how to do these properly and are educated have really done well out of them. As I said, I've done over 30 of these over the years, and I will continue to do these, and definitely a strategy we're going to be using in 2021. So let me know in the comment section below which way you think you can benefit from lease options going forward. And if you like this video, make sure you hit that like button, ensure that you've subscribed to the channel as well, and enable the notification bell so you're notified when these videos are released. And thank you so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you on the next video.